because I'm not Indigenous, is this idea of atonement. And it's something I don't think in the reconciliation conversation has had a lot of attention. But Kyle in the movie talks about, even himself as an Indigenous scholar has benefited from the displacement of Indigenous peoples in his own career, and we need to think about atonement for that. And certainly in my job too as well, there's been a lot of wrongs by Parks Canada and researchers and Western science in where I work, and how do we atone for that?
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I've been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. So if you want, we could jump right into this and welcome you to the Co-Management Commons podcast. I'm super appreciative that you made the time for this. And well, I knew of your work through your writing, but it was also nice to hear about your connection to Lawrence Ignace as well, who was on the podcast. So that was really interesting and shows how small a world that it is. But one of the things I always like to do at the beginning of the podcast is just invite you to introduce yourself to our listeners, because it's always great to learn about our different positionalities and so many different people that are involved in co-management that invite you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Carmen Wong, and I'm a kid from immigrant parents, so first generation Canadian. I live currently in Kwanlin and Whitehorse in the Yukon, and that's primarily because of a job that brought me up here 16 years ago. But my background is, my parents, they worked in labs. My dad was a prof, so I'm brought up in 100% Western science type of world. Went through the graduate program, got a PhD in forest ecology at UBC, and then I got a job with Parks Canada. And that's what brought me up to the Yukon as an ecologist for Kluane National Park and Reserve. And my objective was to set up a monitoring program to monitor the ecological health of the park. And that's where worldviews started, colliding and merging. And that's because the park that I work with is under final agreements and has really strong direction to be managed. And we get more into the technical details of it, to be managed in a co-management type of framework. So that's where, the Western science stuff started to melt away.
And it seems like you were quite comfortable with it melting away, because I know you've done so many innovative things since, or at least it's blending well with other ways of thinking about things, I know. And maybe it'd be interesting to just share a little bit about the Kluane National Park and how it is under a final agreement, and like, what does co-management look like in that sense? Because I think of all the guests that I've talked to so far about co-management, I think this is the first time I've been talking about a park specifically. And be interested to learn more about that one. I'm familiar with the Torngat Mountains National Park on the East Coast in Nunavut, but yeah, maybe you could share more about the park, would be really insightful.
Well, technically, and maybe 8 years ago or so, I would have hesitated in, participating, because technically we're under a cooperative management agreement or framework, and it's not a true co-management scenario. But I think what's super interesting about Kluane is that it was a park created in the 1970s by displacing Indigenous peoples from their land to create, the colonial idea of a wilderness park. And the people affected by that are from Kwanlin First Nation, White River First Nation, and Champagne and Aishihik First Nations. Both Champagne and Aishihik, or CFN, and KFN have final agreements. They're respectively 30 to 20 years old. And in the final agreements, there's a chapter about the management of the park, and it's called cooperative management. The idea is that there's a management board with reps from both First Nations, the local community, non-Indigenous representatives, plus a Parks Canada observer. And then they make decisions, they give advice on decisions, which goes to the minister, so the Minister of Environment. And then that minister ultimately sort of has the final say. So that's kind of that structure. And, that's not co-management where you have the federal minister being the ultimate decision maker. But I think what's interesting, I asked the question of the lawyers who were working on the final agreements of the day. And I asked, why wasn't there a co-management framework in place? And really at the time of the day, it wasn't it wasn't digestible, I think, to the government of Canada to do that kind of framework at that time. So this is sort of what was negotiated at the sort of the best they could get. And I think it's placed us in a place that forces us to work together, to build those relationships, share knowledge. And I don't know if any of the original writers of the final agreement ever thought that we'd be moving, that actually moves you towards co-management. So it was a starting place, and we've definitely moved beyond that. There's lots of sort of nuance of, what kind of decisions go in front of the management board. We have lots of projects on the ground that operate with sort of a co-management governance structure. We have operations that sort of totally run by Parks Canada because they sort of have the skill set to deal with that. And then we have, more complicated projects that are more co-managed. So I would say it's an interesting case because it has started in a different place than many other more modern national parks. So things like places like Haida Gwaii are more co-managed. They started with that right at the get-go. Some of the northern parks are more in the co-management, sort of the pure co-management side of things.
Well, it's definitely fair to say there's so much variation, and I've heard a lot of people talk about how they have learned from some of the earlier agreements that were negotiated, and I think groups have tried to build on them over time. But I certainly feel like cooperative management boards or co-management boards, like they still operate with a lot of the same principles. And as long as we don't dwell on the fact of who has the final decision-making authority all of the time, there's a lot of really good things that we can still do in these spaces. And I'm just curious, like where you've been there now for 16 years and your connection to the cooperative management board, like when you reflect on what you've experienced so far, are there some lessons or things that you think are important to share, like things that have worked really well in this particular region?
I think the first thing that I've learned is, and perhaps it's obvious to anybody who's been working this for a while, but it's everything's evolving and growing. Nothing is static. So when I first arrived, the board was not very strong or active. Lots of turnover in the members, and that's perhaps because is a bit uncertain about how you start those things and how you work together, and even connection to the place and being passionate. I mean, how can you even care about a place that you have been not being able to visit or use as your ancestors would have traditionally used? So there's a lot of that reconnection that had to happen first before people actually care about getting involved in decision making about this place. So that's the first lesson I learned, is that it's evolving. It's continuing to evolve. I think the second is that the management board kind of operates at a level above me, and only big strategic things go there. Like our park management plan, for example, or decisions about species at risk. But how it operates kind of trickles down to the lower levels, and so there's elements of co-management and working together and making decisions together, looking at data together, gathering data together. Elements of that trickle down, and the frequency of that is increasing over time.
Well, one of the things that I've always found interesting is, like, as a staff person, or like, we don't get to make the final decisions either. Like, lots of times there's opinions that I may have, or a colleague, but at the end of the day, it's the co-management board that has to come up with consensus and make advice to the ministers. And just curious, if there's any anecdotes or approaches you could share, and how your team works together, and how you approach that when it comes to providing information or research to the co-management board so that they can make informed decisions. Is that something that be interesting to hear your reflections on that as well? Because it's obviously a vital part of making the whole system work.
And I would say that process is evolving right now. It has ebbed and flowed in terms of strength of the relationship with the board, and it kind of depends on how well the board is staffed. I guess I'll just stop and just say, like, I have a sort of caveat, and you and I talked about this earlier, is just I feel uncomfortable talking about this thing solo, because, as co-management and we talk about process, obviously there's equal players at the table, and I'm just, one view from the sort of more biased towards the Parks Canada side of things. So I think, if you were to ask Shepherd and Aishihik or KFN, obviously there'd be their values and their thoughts on the process would probably be different from, what I'm providing. But in general, we have this monitoring program, and it raises some flags about conservation issues. And I'm even just hesitating about using the word conservation, because that means different things to different people. Our monitoring program is 100% built on Western science. There's lots of biases there, but it's raised some flags about sheep decline. So Dall sheep, they're mountain sheep in Alaska and Yukon. And how do we approach sheep declines? That's been a work in progress, and basically, I, as the ecologist, raise the flag because of the data, but also KFN hunters are raising the flag because of what they're seeing on the ground, and information kind of moves in different pathways. The hunters might go right, in this case, went right to sort of chief and council. Mine went to the management board, but plus the staff at KFN government. So it's I guess what I'm indicating is, like, there's no one process, because every particular issue has different contexts and different players and decision makers. Yeah, so I would say it's a work in progress in terms of how issues get discussed. And in this case, it evolved into a 2-day workshop with citizens and Parks Canada staff, and trying to find a way forward on how to help sheep.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue to a question that, or a topic that I did want to talk to you about, and congratulate you as well on the article that you co-authored towards reconciliation, the 10 calls to action to natural scientists working in Canada. And you and the co-authors addressed a very important topic there. And curious to know what motivated you to write this article, and really interesting now knowing a bit more about your positionality as well. As you said, being raised in a very academic household and coming from that particular perspective. So curious to know more about that article, the process, what motivated it. How did you come up with the 10 calls in particular? Because it's a great article. I know I like sharing it around quite a lot, and definitely interested to learn more about its origins.
Yeah, that's a good question. And yeah, thanks for the compliments. It's something that took us by surprise in terms of the amount of downloads it has and audiences and how it turned into a film, that whole thing. So Gudea the Elder, who's one of the authors, just said there must have been a real thirst for this. And I think each of the co-authors has a probably different motivation for this paper. But mine started with, everyday work in my office. It involves like recognizing that there was displacement of Indigenous people from, the park. And you deal with that in many ways. I've flown in with elders who exit the helicopter and come into a beautiful valley and they burst into tears because it's the first time that they've been to that valley. They've only heard about stories from their mother about, harvesting gophers there or living in that valley. And when you have multiple experiences of this trauma and deep sorrow from the lack of connection, um, you feel like you need to do something as a non-Indigenous person. And so when the 94 calls came out from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I read those to try to find out, is there at least one of them that I can do? And most of them are, aimed at institutions and governments. There's none on science, really. So that was one gap. And there was one on language, which, I started taking language classes as sort of my attempt at doing something. But really became obvious, in your own sphere of influence. And Murray Sinclair says this about the 10 calls or about the 94 calls to action is like every sector of Canadian society needs to change to rebalance um, the relationship with Indigenous people. So, in my own sphere of influence, that's with research and the researchers who were coming to Kwanlin and their experiences with that process. We saw a lot of problems and issues, and that's what really triggered my sort of motivation to pursue the 10 calls to natural scientists. You had asked, how do we arrive with those 10 calls? At the end, well, I should start at the beginning. At the beginning, it started with talking to Lawrence, who's my partner, Lawrence Ignace, and I came home and I was just complaining about a particular research permit where some research had been published without review by either First Nation, and it was doing some cultural interpretation, and a map was provided of sensitive sites. And I just came home and I was like, I can't believe this is happening in 2014 or whatever year it was. I guess it's probably 2016. And Lawrence is like, you're going to be dealing with this type of stuff for the rest of your career. And I was like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my career. I got to do something about this. And that's how that kind of conversation happened. And then we brought in other folks who we work with, who have, either our researchers themselves or the elder Gudea, who's reviewed research permits in Kwanni. And together we came up with 10 calls. And at the very end, we're like, hey, I guess we did co-produce something. Like we didn't really we didn't have principles or a framework or anything, but our relationships carried it through and we co-produced those 10 calls to action.
It's interesting that you ended on that because I know call 3 in particular talks about enabling knowledge sharing and co-production. I'm just wondering how you think of co-production, because sometimes I get asked in the co-management course that I teach, like, what is the co-production of knowledge and what does a good knowledge co-production process look like from your perspective as a natural scientist who cares a lot about these topics? It'd be nice to unpack that a bit for people that may have not tried it yet or new to the field. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm still learning. The example I gave about the 10 calls to action, it happened organically because of our relationships, our very strong relationships between the 5 co-authors who come from very different knowledges and background. You know, we had an elder, we had a staff member from KFN, Calling First Nation Government. We had Lawrence, who is a Anishinaabe, but also worked in the public service, so very mixed background. And then we had Heidi, a Western trained scientist, but who worked in the North. So all of us had these strong relationships, so it kind of came about organically. But when I think about trying to start a whole new process, it's really difficult because there's often power imbalances, and you kind of have to deal with those first before you can even get towards co-producing something. And so often, the challenge that I think many researchers and ourselves as park managers face is that there are other priorities for the First Nation communities that we're working with, and they might not care about the thing that you're caring about because they're worried about education or they're worried about salmon disappearing elsewhere. They just have other more pressing priorities. And so how can you your intention is good. You want to co-produce something from start to finish, objectives, uh, co-analysis of the data, co-interpretation of the data, co-presenting it. You have all these lofty goals, but there's just not enough capacity, or perhaps that's not the priority with that community. So I think it's very challenging because often without having full capacity at each stage, the Western scientist analyst will take over, right, to fill in the gap to keep the knowledge moving. But in reality, you would like to have everyone there at the table to do it. But often there's not enough people or not enough time, or yeah. So I think that's really challenging. I know that's not the full question about co-production. It's like to present challenges right at the get-go. But I think it's important to recognize that you can still walk together, but you might not have all the principles of co-production at the get-go or even at the end. But hopefully you're moving towards a future where you do.
Yeah, and it's a process, no doubt, that evolves over time as well. And I guess further congratulations are also now in order because I think what happened to your article and the fact that it got morphed or translated into a documentary was also very innovative. And I haven't seen, I think it might be the first example that I've seen of that personally. And I'm just curious, how did that happen? And what did that process look like to take an academic paper and turn it into the film, The Signal Fire? I'll definitely put the link to the film in the show notes, and I now share that video with people in a co-management group that I'm a part of, and we'll continue to promote it because it was such a nice compliment and different way of learning about the principles through story and case studies. And it's certainly my impression that that is also co-produced. So maybe but just by sharing your story of how all of that came to be would probably be really instructive as well, and how things can evolve and be co-produced over time when you hit on something that there's an obvious thirst for, like you said.
Yeah. Wow. Oh gosh. And we're surprised that that became a film as well. We still like can't believe it happened, and that it is like a really, every time we watch it, I see something new and I learn something new, and to have it turn out so well too, and to be proud of it. Oh, like it still is amazing feat. You know, in the knowledge co-production thing, when we were working on that call, Gadia the elder said, you know that shared your knowledge in a or the knowledge in a good way, and it's impacted the community in a good way when it becomes part of oral history. And that sort of resonated with me. And then so it just leaves that as a thought. But and moving on to the film, it's when we wrote that, the primary audience was for researchers, and we went academic to a journal because that was the audience we wanted to impact. And it's written in a very academic way, right? Like citations and all this stuff. But Gadiya had always but was behind the scenes saying, like, what are we going to do for the youth? How are we going to make impact to the communities? And we never really addressed it until someone from NRCan, Natural Resources of Canada, approached us. And this is Sophie Silbois, and she's from the Mississaugas of the Scugog Island First Nation. But she's been a public servant for a very long time. And she approached us and said, like, how can we help amplify the messages from this paper? And they had a substantial amount of money, and we were just we were kind of blown away. We were thinking land camps. We were thinking we just brainstormed for a while, and then somebody threw out the idea of a film, and we just were like, ha ha ha, like whatever. But Sophie really picked up on this. She's like, I think a film would be an amazing idea. And then all of a sudden, there we are, Heidi, who is, on faculty with the University of Waterloo. All of a sudden, we're managing a contract, a call for proposals from film companies, and we have no idea, like, how do we even write a call for proposals about a film? Like, what are the things we need to be asking for? And that was a huge learning process. Interestingly enough, 18 companies bid on that call for proposal. So there is quite a bit of interest in trying to translate that paper into a film. We were lucky. We worked with Shot in the Dark Productions. They're a Yukon-based company. Kelly Milner is the producer. She's worked very carefully with us, trying to get the messages across, and she had her own vision and interpretation. And in that film, is the framework of awareness, acknowledgement, action, and atonement. And that's her taking that framework from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there's a bunch of when you're working with film, there's a bunch of interpretation and co-production, between all of us to make that thing. So big learning process of working with new people and new media. And I'm glad that it really turned out.
You are listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Curie Staples and David Silas. Enjoy the rest of the conversation, and thank you for caring about Indigenous co-management and honoring our treaties.
It's interesting what you said there right at the beginning about how each time you watch it now, you're having different reflections and continuing to have new insights. And you're so close to it all and have been involved right from the beginning of the original paper. And for people that we're obviously going to recommend that watch it, do you have a particular favorite part of the film or anything that you'd like to draw people's attention to in it from your perspective?
I think it would depend on who you are. We were very lucky. We had some people jump on board who barely knew us, but we approached because we had heard them speak, or because they were just very thoughtful people about Indigenous worldviews and knowledge systems and changing science, and those folks are in the film. So I think that would be one, is like, paying attention to who's in the film and following them further, sending Pete from UBC, Kyle Bobby Wash, Amy Christensen. There's just a lot of good nuggets from these folks. And the one in particular for me, because I'm not Indigenous, is this idea of atonement. And it's something I don't think in the reconciliation conversation has had a lot of attention. But Kyle in the movie talks about, even himself as an Indigenous scholar has benefited from the displacement of Indigenous peoples in his own career, and we need to think about atonement for that. And certainly in my job too, as well, there's been a lot of wrongs by Parks Canada and researchers and Western science in where I work, and how do we atone for that? One simple example is we're working on doll sheep, as I mentioned before, and on a particular mountain over at least 5 decades, there have been some scientific research there that involved, capturing sheep and populating the Chicago Zoo, collaring 143 sheep to follow them around. So like these are all things that don't really sit well with First Nation partners. So our first step in atonement is understanding the scientific wrongs that happened in the place that we are working. And then, because that's what the community remembers, So if you don't know what the community remembers about science being conducted in the land that you're working in, then you don't fully understand the context that you're in. And so that's sort of the first step of atonement. And that's what we're working on.
Yeah, with that concept of atonement, that's a good way to bring us full circle a little bit in our conversation today, because right at the beginning, you had talked about how the park originally displaced people from their territory, and that obviously would never be acceptable today. But I'm kind of curious if there's initiatives or insights you could share about how, in more recent times, how Parks Canada has helped facilitate, I would say, the reconnection to the park area, or have made atonement. Has there been different initiatives in the case of the Kluane National Park?
Yeah, there's been quite a few initiatives since probably the early 2000s, and still probably a long way to go. But there was something called the Healing Broken Connections, which was a real burst of energy of trying to have on the land camps, and these would be actually harvest camps in different places in the park to really reconnect people, and they still continue since then. One of my experiences early on was, I think I came out of the helicopter and I was like, nothing in my training has ever prepared me for going out with elders and snaring gophers. Like, there's nothing in our scientific training that teaches you, sort of how to behave and how to do that. So yeah, that's sort of one of the examples. Currently, at sort of my sphere of influence, we're working with land guardians in different ways. That involves, gathering information on the land. It also involves reconnecting, so spending more time out there together, seeing the changes from climate change together and trying to interpret that together. And then the other thing is working on issues together. So one of the other conservation issues is with kokanee salmon. And so we've been working with knowledge holders, walking the stream bank together and trying to come up with a hypothesis on what's going on. And it's sort of like a adaptive hypothesis testing as we're going along the stream bank. And that's, I think, where we're moving towards. It's like now we're still trying to reconnect people to place and establish relationships with the land, but now we're also like working together to address issues.
I really like how you keep referring to your own sphere of influence, because in some conversations, I know it's easy for people to get frustrated by not being able to make these big grand changes sometimes, but we all got our own sphere of influence, and we can definitely make good change and good things happen at our own respective levels. And I know throughout my career, I've always liked to sort of think about things that I could do that where I didn't have to ask anybody for permission, and I could just go and do good initiatives and make change. And worst case scenario may have to ask for forgiveness, but it's really rare that you have to do that if you're doing good things, right? Usually other people want to then be involved and help be a part of positive changes. So I really like how you speak that way, because we can all do good at whatever our position happens to be in a co-management system. And I guess just with one of the things I'm a little bit curious, this is just for my own curiosity, because where I'm from, we don't have a lot of interactions with gophers. So you kind of got my attention when you said about getting out of the helicopter to go and catch some of them. And what is the relationship with gophers in that part of Canada?
Yeah, right off the bat, the word gopher brings up the dichotomy between Western science and Indigenous knowledge, because technically it's not a gopher, it's an Arctic ground squirrel, but it is, locally called gopher, but really, really highly valued animal. There are robes made out of gopher fur, so like hundreds and hundreds of little gophers make these beautiful robes. They're considered quite a good thing to eat. One of the elders told me it was like a T-bone steak, a tiny T-bone steak. and then it's definitely when we talk about being on the land, that's one of the activities that comes up very often is, oh, well, we can go snaring for gophers. It has a lot of deeply entrenched, and long-term history. Unfortunately, gophers aren't doing very well. The lower elevation gopher populations are kind of dying out, and we're not quite sure why. At high elevation, they seem to be doing okay, but there's some thinking that climate change plays a role because of the flooding of the burrows.
Interesting. I've never eaten a Arctic ground squirrel, so I'm curious what a tiny T-bone steak would taste like now. So appreciate you sharing that. And that kind of makes me think of another question I like asking people lately, and about Indigenous knowledge. And I started asking this question after having some conversations with Dr. Deborah McGregor, who always articulates Indigenous knowledge as a verb and as an action and skills and things people just know how to do. And I'm just curious now, with all of your interactions with monitoring and being with Parks Canada and being involved with co-management, have you picked up any Indigenous knowledge or skills? Like, like, as an example, do you know how to clean a gopher now, or how to cook one? Have you picked up any kind of skills or knowledge along the way?
I think anybody who's watched me attempt to skin a gopher or a muskrat would say no. It takes way too long. But it is interesting to think about Indigenous knowledge and consider it an action and a verb, because one of the things I am really trying to change is, our whole monitoring program. It's like I said before, it's built on Western science. We have these metrics that are very quantitative. And right now we're going through a program of rethinking the entire program, which is like taking something I've built up over the last 16 years and pretty much taking it down to back to the ground. When you're thinking about decolonizing a monitoring program, really the original monitors were Indigenous people on the land, and the data that was coming in, um, people call observations, but it was, long-term data sets that guided people's ability to survive on the land and make decisions. And so trying to sort of reinstate that, or at least recuperate elements of that is sort of our next stage, and we have a long, long way to go. But I mean, that's ultimately where I hope Indigenous knowledge and sort of my relationship with it, like hopefully just creating a space for that would be, the least I can do in my career.
Yeah, I'm really interested to follow how you do that and implement it because that's it kind of connects with an observation I've noticed when some of the earlier Indigenous knowledge studies. Well, some continue to happen this way where people will do qualitative interviews and it'll produce these documents that are sort of like a point in time and I've been trying to get my mind around and wondering, similar to you, it sounds like, how do we monitor Indigenous knowledge on an annual or ongoing basis? Like, this is a time series, and to use that language, a data set that continues to grow and evolve and has such a long time series behind it right now. So I'm really curious to learn more about you and how you implement that going down the road because I think that's going to be really powerful to see more examples of that of Indigenous knowledge at the core of monitoring.
Yeah. I can going back to the gopher, I can tell you the mistakes I've made in my, and I think where a lot of like early users and abusers of the concept of working with Indigenous knowledge is, you extract what you think is important and you put it in a quote in your report and you attribute it to the elder, the knowledge holder who shared that with you. And with gophers originally, I heard that there was, both First Nations really wanted to understand gophers over time, and we talked about using a Western science sort of occupancy method for their burrows use. We talked about using sort of a taste metric, like how much fat was on their body, did they look healthy? So using it more interview type thing. And in the long run, it never really worked out because we were too early in that process because we were trying to fit it into this whole idea of monitoring, coming up with a metric. Where I think we're going to go is this whole idea is that gopher hunting is Indigenous knowledge. It's a way of being. The whole use and the whole process of, hunting gophers, eating gophers, using gophers, that's Indigenous knowledge. And you can't just extract a piece out of that. It's that whole practice that ends up being your monitoring program. And if you have in-depth knowledge about gophers from trapping gophers, then that's what's going to guide your monitoring decisions in the future. And I don't know if I'm explaining that very well. I'm just really rethinking everything in its early days. But yeah.
No, I think that makes a ton of sense personally, and it worries me in a sense because if gophers aren't doing very well, as you mentioned, how can people continue to successfully snare them? And then that puts that monitoring and knowledge at risk. And the same thing with things like salmon, obviously, are not doing as good as we would like. So I do worry about cultural continuity, which is so closely connected with monitoring the way you're articulating it. So, and I guess I've been in a few debates over time in my own career where it gets tangled up with conservation and balancing those different values of do you completely stop harvesting a species and that seems to be the go-to instrument sometimes, which to me feels a bit blunt. And we haven't recognized enough. Well, when we do that, we're really putting cultural continuity at risk then, and we're ending a monitoring program essentially. So, yeah, that concerns me with the way some of our species are going, unfortunately. But I really like how you explained that. I think it makes a lot of sense personally, and it's great points to continue to make.
Yeah, I think you said that well. I'm just making a few notes myself. The idea that you're disrupting, by supposedly conserving and stopping to harvest a species, you're actually disrupting your monitoring program, your own knowledge generation, and the cultural continuity. Yeah, you said that very well.
Well, I know it's a beautiful day, and I'd encourage you to stay connected with the Co-Management Commons podcast because we recently have a new partnership with UConn University where we're going to collaborate and do a number of interviews with First Nations members who are also connected with co-management to get that community perspective as well. So if there's people that who would make great interview guests, please forward their names along. And some new colleagues that I'm now collaborating with at UConn, you would reach out to them, and we're going to have a lot more content from the UConn in the second season.
Well, that's very cool. And I saw I had a quick glance of who you've had on your podcast, and it's like, wow, I'm quite flattered you asked me. I feel you have a really great group of folks there.
Yeah, well, I think you make really great company amongst them. And I appreciate the feedback as well. It's been fun to see how willing people are to talk about co-management. I guess there was a thirst for that as well, and there hasn't been a community of us, and yet there's a lot of us doing co-management right across the country. So I'm hoping through this podcast and through the Co-Management Commons website, more of us that are working in this field of practice can share information, hopefully get together even more in the future in person and so on. So by you participating, you've contributed to that now. So I really appreciate your time today. And hopefully we'll stay in touch now, and would love to have some help getting around the national park at some point in the future. So I'll definitely look you and Lawrence up if I'm in Whitehorse in the
Oh,
year.
yeah, for sure. Yeah. That we'd love to host you. And yeah, you're definitely hitting your website and your course and your podcasts are hitting, like you said, a gap in this knowledge on about co-management.
All right, you take care.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation.